Hello and good morning. I'm trying to recreate a video for December 6th Bible study lesson in case you missed it and you wanted to see it. I'm walking through a PowerPoint here on relevant revelation. If I put it in full view, you lose my camera in the bottom left-hand corner, so I apologize for the small view here, but hope you're on a device where you can read these. Otherwise, I pretty much read it to you also, so that helps. I'm going to introduce my lesson today with the book Relevant Revelation. It's a book that I wrote and published in 2019. If you're interested in more information, you can go to www.relevantrevelation.com. But I'm going to introduce for you in two sessions, one today and one December 13th, as a Bible study. And of course, we can't go through the whole book, but I am focusing on a couple of items today and also next week. So let's see what we're about to embark upon. I have an introduction to let you know that we're looking at the Bible as one continuous story from Genesis to Christ. And as we look at the Bible and read the Bible in large sections, we get a sense of that story, of that brilliant connections between books and generations and people and events throughout the Bible. It points to one author when we read it that way, which is exciting as we see things expose and as we look at layers beneath layers, we start to expose more of the Bible's truth. And so that's exciting to see that those little perspectives and connections between stories were purposeful from a God who is a God of order. It shows that the New Testament finishes what the Old Testament started. You wouldn't read a great novel or a mystery by looking at the last chapter first or getting to reread the last chapter. You want to appreciate the story as it unfolds. And so, like a great novel, we're going to look at the Bible, the greatest story ever told, with at least that much respect and appreciation. It also gives Bible students a schema on which to organize people, places, and events when you realize that the Bible is laid out in a view of Israel's history from beginning to the point in the story where Israel ceases to exist, and then ultimately in Israel's afterlife or appreciation for heaven. So this also will allow you to open and have open conversations with people. The style of evangelism where we talk to folks about their need for Jesus because they're a sinner and because they need reconciliation and they need forgiveness for their sin is a challenge, not to sound like you're being judgmental. It just is. And millions of people have become Christians in a format like that, usually by a speaker on a podium that doesn't know them personally, but they're able to share the gospel that way. And I'm grateful for that. That is the way that my mother came to Jesus. But I also think that as we know people and love people in our lives, we can have conversations about what the Bible means to us. And not only does that build our biblical literacy as a growing and maturing Christian, but it also opens up conversations that are less off-putting than talking to someone about their sin. And so, but yet we can still have the message of restoration, reconciliation, and forgiveness that's in the Bible and that we find through Jesus Christ. We can talk about that in the way that we're learning it through better understanding God's Word. Today, we're going to look at one of the themes that we talk about in Relevant Revelation in this book, and it is that the history of Israel is laid out in the Bible in such a way that it mirrors the life stages of a human. It may be because I was studying psychology at the time when I was learning and absorbing so much of the Bible when I was in college. Maybe that's what led me here. But when I was reading and studying the Bible in my 20s and going to school in divinity, I was struck by particularly in Exodus, how immature the Israelites were, how shockingly disobedient they were, and yet how God extended to them so much mercy and compassion despite their foolishness. And that was the beginning for me of looking for other stages of life in the Bible. And of course, well, I don't know, maybe not a course for you, but for me, it seems like I can't see it any other way now. But the Garden of Eden seemed to also be like a womb in the sense that Adam and Eve were expelled from it. I liken it to a womb for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons that I can easily convey to you is that, like a womb, a baby is protected and provided for, um, uniquely protected and provided for, um, miraculously protected and provided for. And yet, inevitably, the baby must be expelled, must be uh, put out into the real world, so to speak. And so that reminded me of the Garden of Eden story, where Adam and Eve are protected and provided for in that garden in a miraculous way, and yet they are eventually expelled. Um, and then what comes before the womb is conception, a very mysterious process. I've read books, I've had my own children. I understand to some degree about how conception occurs, but it's still very miraculous and mysterious. And I think that is mirrored in chapter 1 of Genesis, as we have the conception of physical life as we know it. The creation story in 6 days is reminding us of, yes, God is the creator, but there is still so much mystery surrounding that, so much miraculous creation that occurs. And as we think about it, there really is something very difficult to comprehend about things that are very, very small, like an atom, and things that are very, very large, like a universe. And so I think there is connections there for me in the great, miraculous, and mysterious chapter 1 of Genesis and conception. So you can see here in the table of context that outlines the order of this book that I have in capital letters the life stages of a human: conception, birth, infancy, childhood, adulthood, death, and heaven as an afterlife. And then also you can see that chronologically there are sections of the Bible that seem to mirror that. I've already talked about creation mirroring conception, and the Garden of Eden being similar to a birth. Another support for this theory might be the themes and the symbols that occur in the Garden of Eden. Remember, in the first 3 chapters of Genesis, you have, well, let's think specifically Garden of Eden. You wouldn't have that story if you didn't have eating, if you didn't have that their eyes were open, and if you didn't have a sense of naming also occurs. So aren't those the things that happen at a birth? Don't you wait for the child's eyes to open? Isn't there an immediate idea that that the child will eat, will feed, or nurse, and and they're obviously born naked, and obviously nakedness is a part of the theme in the Garden of Eden as well. There's a great deal of birth motif, I guess I could say, in Genesis, particularly chapters 2 and 3. Then in Exodus, oh my goodness, like I said, this is one of the things that stood out to me: the immaturity of the Israelites when they are in the desert following Moses, just the foolishness and disobedience. When they actually make it across the promised land, across the Red Sea, they have had a front row seat to the 10 plagues, all those miracles, the parting of the Red Sea. And then when they're in the wilderness, how they continue to disobey God, complain to God. And yet God has such incredible patience, like a parent with a young child. In the monarchy period with Saul, David, and Solomon, obviously the section and even a little before in the Judges section and in the monarchy section, Israel's main focus is on battle and politics and power and defending itself. Those are all themes of adulthood. And of course, it is later on in the monarchy period during the prophet section, it's the darkest period of Israel's history. And eventually, Israel ceases to exist. If that's not a motif for death, I don't know what is. It is not until Israel ceases to exist. We're talking about the date marker of 722, the Assyrian conquest, and Israel is conquered and no longer exists as a nation. And Judah is the only remaining tribe of Israel in the southern kingdom. And it's a dark period as they as they are guided by God through the prophets. Don't always listen, but wait. And the message of the prophets is full of condemnation, of judgment, but there's still hope. And Israel is called to repentance, and they are reminded of the hope of the Messiah, who will be a descendant of David. And that ushers in the New Testament, where Jesus comes sharing the message of the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So, in brief, this shows you kind of how we're stepping back and flying overhead at 20,000 feet and looking at the Bible as one continuous story. When we see reoccurring themes, we know that the author is trying to emphasize something, show something as significant. We should pay attention to that, and we should try to understand what the author's trying to help us to understand. You are welcome to pause here and read this, but I'm going to move on. This is a little question, might be hard for you to read, so I'm happy to read it out loud. I have discussion questions for every chapter, so I'm just highlighting the one that I wanted to talk about today. Remember these 3 questions when you read. What does the passage say? Why? What does it say about God, and why is it here? Genesis 1 is the reader's introduction to God. What does it tell us about God? Imagine the Bible, or imagine Genesis without chapter 1, without the 6 to 7 days creation. That teaches us something about God. Obviously, he's the creator. But imagine that part wasn't there and we just started in the Garden of Eden. We would have God be one of the he would protect and provide for his children, Adam and Eve. But then when they sin, he curses them and expels them out of the garden. I'm glad we have Genesis 1, because Genesis 1 teaches us that God is not only the great creator, but he is a God of order, purpose, and plan. And so we see that the story of Eden falls within his purpose and plan. Let's see. Tell us what it is in Genesis 1 that's unique about the perspective of God. And of course, he is the creator in that. We are looking at several other themes in the Bible in this book. We don't have time to get through all of them today and next week, but Genesis, birth of a nation. We're going to look at barren women in particular next week, brothers in conflict, younger brother favored by God. You've probably read through Genesis and noticed there's a lot of brother stories. And then we talk about resolved conflict too, and a change of heart. Yes, so that's a little bit of an overview of where we're going. You can pause here and read this slide if you like. We've talked about it already. I do just want to mention the barren woman theme. There are 3 barren women mentioned in Genesis, and they all give birth to powerful men of God. Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, those are the sons of the barren women who are healed by God. And then we have the brothers in conflict theme. And these are the brothers that stand out as the strongest examples of brothers in conflict in Genesis. And so just to run through them, again, we're looking at brothers in conflict. Cain and Abel. Abel is favored by God. We know that from the story, but there's conflict. And eventually there's no resolution because Cain kills Abel. Ishmael and Isaac, there's jealousy, like there was with Cain and Abel. There's jealousy, but there's no resolution. They just go their separate ways. And in fact, Sarah sends Ishmael and Hagar away, but they do come together at Abraham's burial, and then they go again their separate ways. Jacob and Esau. Jacob, of course, is favored. Esau's very jealous when the birthright and blessing is stolen from him by deception, understandably. And then Jacob goes through a 14 to 20 year process of earning Rachel from Laban. And in that process, he changes quite a bit. He has a great change of heart. He has a heart of generosity toward Esau, goes back and seeks Esau and his forgiveness. And that's a beautiful story, and a beautiful picture of how Jacob is filled with love and appreciation and wanting his brother's forgiveness. They embrace, Esau forgives, but they do go their separate ways after that. And then the 12 brothers, the 12 sons of Jacob, are the final brother story in Genesis. And of course, it is one of my favorites, the most elaborate forgiveness to the brothers in conflict theme in that story, whereby Joseph is actually in a position where he can test his brothers to see if they've had a change of heart. And they do pass the test. So in the end, they are actually embracing tearfully, have this beautiful emotional moment of forgiveness together. So sin is used for the first time with Cain. Compare sin in the Garden of Eden with the sin in Cain's story and talk about God's intervention in these two stories of temptation. Does God warn, intervene, or protect from consequences in these stories? So I wanted to look at layering of stories, and this is my final slide, and so we're going to spend some time on this. The question I just read had to do with Cain and sin. And so this slide has two sections to it, the gray and the purple. So I'll get to the purple in a minute, but we're going to start with the gray. You know that the Garden of Eden story has sin in it, right? The fall of humankind is what it's often called. Adam and Eve are being tempted by the serpent. In the Garden of Eden, as I say, Adam and Eve are tempted by the serpent. And when you read that story and discuss it and take it seriously, ask yourselves the questions, what does this passage say? What does it say about God? And why is it here? You will probably get to the question of, why didn't God intervene? Or where was God when the serpent was tempting Eve? That is a great question. And I think it's part of the brilliance of the Bible that it's not answered in that story, but it does seem to be answered in the story that comes after it. Because the story that comes after the Garden of Eden is, of course, Cain and Abel's story, where Cain is actually upset that Abel's offering was favored. And we do have God intervene in that story. In fact, Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. I'm at Genesis 4, verse 6. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, and you must master it." So God goes to Cain. God goes to Cain in this second story of sin. Now, I say second story of sin, but the first story doesn't have sin in it, which is another interesting point. Sin is not called sin until the Cain and Abel story, right here, as a matter of fact. This is the first use of sin is actually in the Cain and Abel story. It's interesting that it's not in the garden. It's as if the author is using a literary device to not call sin sin in the garden. He or she is saying that there is no sin in the garden. But we know when we read the story, clearly there was. But it's not called sin in the garden. The author waits to call it sin here in verse 7 with Cain. Sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, and you must master it. So when we compare these two stories, and they already have a link because they are the first sins in the Bible, number 1 and number 2. So when we look at that, as I said, in the garden, you might ask, why didn't God intervene? The very next story of sin happens the very next chapter. And the answer is in that. God does intervene. The new question is, does it matter? Well, let me help you with that. The very next verse, after God intervenes with Cain and tries to talk to him and tries to guide him and tries to direct him away from sin, the very next verse, now Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out to the field. And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. That is the very next verse. It did not matter. God's intervention wouldn't matter. It's fascinating to think about. If you go back to the the Adam and Eve story, and you think, well, if God had intervened with Adam and Eve, that's fine. Maybe the serpent would have run away. But wouldn't the serpent have come back? Wouldn't they have looked at the tree again? Wouldn't they have been tempted again to eat from the tree that God told them not to eat from? And even if they were righteous and never were tempted, wouldn't their children be tempted? I think it's pretty clear Cain would have been tempted. we know the character of Cain, so it's pretty clear that he would have been tempted. My point is that when you see these two stories and the connection between them, you get a bigger truth, and that is that it's not up to God to intervene in our temptation. It's up to us. We have to seek God. It begs the next question. Okay, fine. Where was God when Adam and Eve were tempted? Another question would be, why didn't Adam and Eve call on God when they were tempted? That's a better question, isn't it? Both are valid, but that's a great question. And then with Cain and Abel, why didn't Cain ask God what he should do? Guess what? He didn't have to. God told him. He knew what he was supposed to do, but he still did the wrong. He still went after the temptation to listen to his jealousy and his anger and not God. And so you have that message under the surface of those stories of sin. Now look forward to other sin stories. God does not intervene to prevent sin, but he works with the sinners to accomplish his will. So look at, for example, Moses. Moses kills the guard. He strikes the rock, and he is cursed for that, not allowed to go into the promised land. You could argue, gosh, that's a little harsh, but of which to whom much is given, much is expected. He's held to a high level of accountability. But he should have asked God. That's how he could have escaped that or avoided that. But he's not perfect. None of these people, that's one of the beautiful, amazing things about the Bible, is that every single major character, certainly the ones that have calls on their lives by God, the ones that are favored by God, every single one of them is flawed. And I think that's another layer to the story, that God works with people despite their sin. He works with them. He even works with their sin to bring about his purposes. Another example is David. David commits murder, adultery, and false witness. He breaks a ton of the commandments, and yet he's David. He's king. He's the chosen one of God, the man after God's own heart. And notice how this is developing. Moses goes to God and seeks his guidance over and over and over and over again. David sought God's forgiveness of his sin, and for that, and all of the Psalms that he wrote, and all of the good that he did, and for the example that he was, God used him. Okay, so you can see how we're making connections with sin in the gray, and we're seeing how those stories connect and what new information is being shared with each chronological story. Now let's look at the purple. How about Noah and the flood? You read Noah and the flood, and again, brilliant story here. The Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his hearts was only evil all the time. The Lord was grieved that he had ever put man on earth. Okay, so he completely wipes out everyone on the face of the earth but Noah. One of the questions that a thoughtful person reading that story would be, is God too harsh? That seems harsh. You mean to tell me that nobody on the earth, except for Noah and his family, deserved to live? Not one? Not another family? Not somebody clear across the earth? Really? Is God too harsh? The Bible really doesn't answer that question. Not in the flood story. It's true, he does have a promise and a rainbow and a covenant. That's true. All of those tell us a great deal about God and his desire to continue to have relationship with humankind. That is true, and that he does honor the righteous. That's true too. But it does seem like he's a little harsh. No, he seems like he's very harsh. And so we're left with that question, and it's not answered. But then in chapter 12, we have Abraham, and in chapter 18, we have Sodom and Gomorrah. And again, when you read those stories and you ask, what do they say? What do these passages say? You will connect those stories because they're very similar. They're about the total annihilation of large groups of people who are wicked. And so when you read the Sodom and Gomorrah story, I hope that you would connect it with the flood because, again, it has that similar theme of total annihilation of the wicked. But what's different about the Sodom and Gomorrah story? There's a couple things that are different, but the thing I'm going to focus on is this question, is God too harsh? Because that question would come up again in the Sodom and Gomorrah story. Gosh, that seems awful. You can't tell me that there's nobody in Sodom and Gomorrah that's righteous. In fact, that is exactly what Abraham argues to God. Abraham negotiates with God and says, are you going to tell me that if there are 50 righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah, that you would destroy it? And God says, no. I'll tell you what, if there's 50 righteous people, I will not destroy it. And then Abraham stops and thinks, this is, by the way, chapter 18 of Genesis, around verse 26, if I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake. And so Abraham starts to get a little nervous. Well, maybe there's not 50. How about 40? How about 30? How about 20? And they go back and forth. And God says, yes, for 20 righteous people, I will not destroy it. And then Abraham gets a little nervous. Maybe there's not 20 righteous people. How about 10? So they get all the way down to 10. And God says, for 10, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. And if you know the rest of the story, you imagine, like Abraham, surely there's 10 righteous people in Sodom. Surely there is. I mean, think about it. There's Lot, there's Lot's wife, there's Lot's daughters, and his son-in-laws. So there's at least 6, just a member of Abraham's family. Abraham, of course, is the father of the faithful. Surely his nephew and his family are righteous. But as the story unfolds, you learn that the brothers-in-law, the sons-in-law of Lot, they laugh at the angels when they tell them to leave Sodom. They laugh at them. They don't believe. And you learn, of course, Lot's wife looks back and disobeys the angels, looks back and does exactly what they warned her not to do. And then when Lot and his daughters are saved from Sodom, we learn that the daughters get Lot drunk and sleep with him so that they can be impregnated. We learn very clearly that there was not 10 people who were righteous in Sodom. There wasn't anybody in Sodom that was righteous. Not one. Abraham, I'm sure, was grieved. Not one. God was grieved. So that is another example of when you read the flood story and you read the Sodom and Gomorrah story and you recognize that there's a connection or a shared theme, you can see the development. And in this case, you had a question in the flood story that's answered in the Sodom story. It is brilliant stuff. So then you might think, well, okay, where does this go? Is there another time when a large group of people sin terribly, and does God wipe them out? And in fact, there is a large group, actually, I'm speaking a large group of people of God who, there are other groups of people who work against God's people that God um, annihilates through Joshua and the other army, the Israelite armies. But what came to my mind as an example would be the Israelites themselves. When Moses went up on the mountain to get the Ten Commandments, what were the Israelites doing at the foot of the mountain? They couldn't wait 1 month for God to give Moses, and they're watching the presence of God on the mountaintop. They're watching a miracle, and they still do this. You remember what I'm talking about? They, under Aaron's leadership, melt all of their gold and they form a golden calf and they worship it. When you read it, it's shocking. Absolutely shocking that they would be so foolish to do that. So misguided, deceived, wicked is probably the best word. Why they would be so wicked to do that. But ladies and gentlemen, what does God do? It's true, a couple of thousand of them are wiped out. That's true. There was a consequence to their misbehavior, but the whole group wasn't wiped out, and they deserved that. So, what is the question we're left with? Interestingly, is God harsh enough? That's the question we're left with in that series and development of story. I hope that you're starting to appreciate reading the Bible in a different way. Understanding the Bible as one continuous story is important. It is obviously a goal of mine to help biblical literacy. So I hope that is part of this new way of reading the Bible. It also helps to show, and I hope will help you to appreciate the brilliance of the Bible. That scribes copying this book by hand for their entire lifetime, every note and tittle and scribe, every word, every character is there for a reason. And when you read the Bible that way and really operate under that assumption, you will so much better appreciate its brilliance. And I'm sure there's so much more that we will never fully grasp, but I still want to try. And so I hope that helps to help you to appreciate where we're going, not just this week, but next week too. All right. Let's see. Love, love, love. Next week is going to be lightning fast. I love this stuff so much. If I have the opportunity, I'm going to share as much as I can. So I apologize ahead of time for next week going really fast. As we look at the barren woman, we look at the favored brother theme, and we look at the brothers in conflict theme, and how all three of those culminate from the Old Testament to the New Testament in the coming of Christ. So I hope that helps you for today, and thank you for listening. And if you want to have more information about the book, like I said, you can go to relevantrevelation.com and see that, or you can email me, which my information's on the website too. So I thank you, and I hope you have a great week.